Today is September 6, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, the continued Ukrainian offensive, where things stand right now and where things might possibly go, and more specifically about the Western media and this steadily increasing admission that the offensive is failing and that Ukraine's prospects into the future are increasingly bleak. Let's start by taking a look at the map. LiveUAmap.com is a pro-Ukrainian live map, so please keep that in mind as we look at it. And as we look at it, we were hearing a lot over the last week about Ukrainian success, a turning point for their offensive, and yet when we look here, we don't really see much of anything. And as I've pointed out before, this pro-Ukrainian map very much overestimates the amount of territory that Ukraine has taken. There is still fighting over Robotyno and Verbove, and even the Western media is admitting that. And if we go to the Donbas region, we will see that even this pro-Ukrainian map is admitting that Russia continues to make small gains. Occasionally, when you check this, you will see the red rifle icons. That means Russian troops are on the move. Not that they've taken territory, but they are attempting to advance at a minimum. And so that's what even a pro-Ukrainian map has to show us. Let's take a look at some Western media headlines discussing the current fighting, the current status of the fighting in Ukraine right now, especially regarding this offensive. So the first article we'll take a look at is from the BBC. Ukraine war, counteroffensive troops punch through Russia line, generals claim. This is from 20 hours ago. The article says Ukrainian generals claim they have breached Russia's formidable first line of defenses in the south as the counteroffensive launched earlier this summer may be poised to gather pace. Since June, Kiev's territorial gains have been very small, but is Ukraine finally at a turning point? That is a question that they're asking. The answer is obviously no, but they continue in the article. They say, yes, it's true, says Yuri Sak, an advisor to Ukraine's defense minister. When asked if the breach had happened, little by little, I think we're gaining momentum, he said. We are now between the first and second defensive lines. One of Ukraine's top generals in the south, Brigadier General Alexander Tarnovsky, told Britain's Observer newspaper. But if you look at this article, you scroll down, it even includes a map, and down here in purple it says held or regained by Ukraine. So that is what they would have gained amid this now three full months plus offensive. And as you can see, there's a blotch of purple here, and then Robotyno, there's supposedly gains being made there, but the dot for this village obscures the amount of territory they supposedly are now holding or have regained. And that's how minimum the gains have been for Ukraine, the supposed gains of Ukraine. As you can see, the objective of Ukraine's offensive is to reach the Sea of Azov here, this area right here, to reach Melitopol or Mariupol or even just Tokmak. But that is how little progress they've made over the last 3 months. Now, we keep hearing this, we're gaining momentum, it's gathering pace. But in reality, how could that possibly be? If you are exhausting your forces, if your forces are now much weaker than when you started, and you have not even gotten through the first actual line of Russian defenses, and there are several lines of Russian defenses, how are you possibly going to gain momentum or pace? And the answer is, you're not going to. It's impossible. It will not happen. And that map, by the way, this map in the BBC article, is courtesy of the Institute for the Study of War. This is a US-based think tank, and it is extremely pro-Ukrainian. So this is the best that they can show you, the limits of their ability to spin what is a so far failed Ukrainian offensive. The article continues, and it says these words by this Ukrainian general echoes those of the White House spokesman John Kirby, who on Friday, which is September 1st, told reporters in Washington that Ukrainian forces have achieved some success against that second line. Now, what are they talking about? First, second, third lines. They're talking about the security zone, which in it does have temporary fortifications like trench lines, but mostly it is an area where Russia is conducting a mobile defense. And this is where the fighting has taken place over the last 3 months. The fighting has not reached and surely has not breached the first of several defensive lines that Russia had created starting all the way back last year. And they will not explain this clearly because they want to try to make this look like it is something much more than it actually is. But you saw the map and you saw how minimum those gains actually are. And I mentioned Ukraine suffering catastrophic losses. This is something that even the Western media is admitting. I want to show you this article from the Times. Ukraine counteroffensive. I'm ready to die. 90% of the guys here will die too. And down here it says, elite Ukrainian troops tell Anthony Lloyd the terrible price they are paying to break through Russian lines during the summer offensive. And unfortunately, they have not broken through Russian lines, and it's no longer summer. So those are the first two problems with this entire article. The article goes on and it says, in the 10 days since Ukraine's storm troops first managed to enter the ruined school building at Robotino, a tiny settlement straddling the first of 3 Russian defense lines that lies 8 miles south of the original start point of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in early June, June 4th. To be exact, the capture of the village has been heralded as a milestone strategic shift by Ukrainian commanders and U.S. officials in a counteroffensive that has been dogged by huge casualties, equipment deficiencies, and bitter disputes over schedule and timing. It is going very poorly. They are admitting that it's going very poorly, and part of this failure includes catastrophic losses. We continue to hear about fighting around Robotino. Even in this article, they do not make it sound as if this entire very small village has even been taken by Ukrainian troops. And then there's the very real possibility that Russia will just conduct a counteroffensive and push Ukrainian forces back out, which is what they have been doing over the last 3 full months now. The article is citing a Ukrainian soldier only referred to as Boyet, and he says, we know that, sure, we've breached the first line of the Russians, but what a cost. And so they're talking about how they're getting through the security zone, but it is at an extremely high cost. And then you have to ask yourself, to what extent, what have they lost? Their last brigades that they prepared for this offensive are now being used in the security zone. What do they have left to use? And the answer is not much. The article continues and it says, early hopes that the operation could be carried by Leopard tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles to have a decisive impact by the end of the summer now appear forlorn, of course. And for people who were being objective, before the offensive was even launched, they knew that that was going to be the case. The article continues, it says, instead, the conduct of the campaign has been thrown into the realm of men on their feet. The storm groups such as those of the Skala Battalion, who that soldier they cited belongs, infiltrating through minefields under the cover of darkness and fighting desperate close quarter struggles to clear Russian trenches by night before armored vehicles can be brought forward. Bradleys and Leopards are great until they hit a mine and can't move and get smothered by Russian artillery, says Boyet, whose unit joined the counteroffensive after Ukrainian mechanized units became repeatedly bogged down in minefields along the Robotino front. Really, our big lesson of the summer is that mostly we go in on an attack at night carried by just our legs. The armored vehicles come up later. So they're admitting that there is very meager progress being made. They're admitting that it needs to be made by troops basically infiltrating by foot into the security zone, and they're still suffering heavy losses, and it's still questionable about what they're achieving by bringing this armor forward. A lot of it just seems to be being destroyed, and I'll get into some of this armor being destroyed here in just a little bit. including the first British Challenger 2 tank being destroyed. The article says the success of these highly committed assault troops may be the key to further breaches of Russian lines, but it is also needs-must fighting that ensures Ukraine will have secured only the slenderest of breakthroughs in Russian lines before the autumn. The great hopes that were originally put on Ukraine's Western-equipped armored formations, such as the 47th Mechanized Brigade, have crumbled in the face of the realities that many analysts talked about for months before the offensive was launched, about how you cannot just create new brigades out of thin air with Western equipment and using Western tactics, which include conscripts who have no military background at all. You cannot shape them into an effective brigade over the course of just a few months. It takes a year or more. Now they're starting to admit that reality. That is the reality that they are facing, that all of this propaganda is crumbling in the face of. No sooner had the 47th Brigade spearheaded the main attack on the southern front in early June than it suffered heavy losses. Without air support and with limited mine-clearing abilities, the brigade found that its armored vehicles were frequently immobilized in Russian minefields and then pounded with artillery. And this article also includes a map. And again, it is the same very meager gains. If you don't look close enough, you won't even notice them. That is the reality of this now 3-month offensive. When you read this article, you get the sense that Ukrainian forces are exhausted, which they are, that they're depleted, their offensive potential has been exhausted, which it has, and you get the idea, the feeling that there is still so much further for Ukrainian troops to go. And they don't specifically talk about the details of Russian defense lines, but there are layers and layers of defenses that stretch all the way to Crimea, all the way to the Azov Sea, the Sea of Azov. If they have struggled this much and they have lost this much just to get to Robotyno, and they still have not fully taken it, with what they have left, they are not getting to the Sea of Azov. And even if they somehow managed to do so, they would have nothing left when they arrived. And this is what I had been saying for months before the offensive even began. The only hope for Ukraine, if somehow they manage to make it through all of these layers of defenses that they have yet to even reach, for them to reach the Sea of Azov and somehow emerge victorious, it would depend on Russian forces being even more depleted, more exhausted, and Russia with much less to reconstitute its forces with. And there's no evidence at all that suggests that Russia is in such a position. As a matter of fact, there's this article right here I'd like to point out from Reuters. Ukrainian intercepts show Russian soldiers' anger at losses, disarray. And here it says excerpts from 17 phone calls placed in early July by Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine and intercepted by Ukrainian intelligence services, the SBU, show them complaining about poor equipment and heavy losses. It's talking about 17 phone calls placed by Russian soldiers fighting in the south and east of Ukraine that were intercepted in the first 2 weeks of July by the Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, the country's main intelligence agency. The expletive-laden intercepts shared with Reuters by a Ukrainian intelligence source provide a rare, albeit partial, glimpse into the conditions of some Russian soldiers as Kiev prosecuted a major counteroffensive which started in early June, two military analysts told Reuters. Indeed, this is a very partial glimpse. We're talking 17 phone calls among tens of thousands of Russian soldiers. And when you really think about it, it's either Ukraine's ability to intercept these phone calls is terrible, and they've only picked up 17 total, and all 17 of them depict this terrible situation Russia is supposedly in, or over the last 3 months, they've only been able to intercept 17 phone calls that create the illusion of Russian forces suffering heavy losses and fighting under terrible conditions. And Reuters goes on and it says, while Russia has so far largely stemmed Ukraine's military campaign and made some modest territorial gains of its own in places, the soldiers in the intercepts complain that their units have suffered from heavy losses, a lack of munitions, proper training and equipment, as well as poor morale. And the reality is, in any large military operation, you're going to have some units somewhere that may be suffering from temporary disorganization, or maybe just bad luck, maybe very localized poor leadership. But again, overall, out of tens of thousands of troops, you only can cite 17 phone calls over the course of 3 full months. There's also the reality that, and I experienced this when I was in the Marines, even under training conditions, you have some people, young people, who are just going to complain about things no matter what. They'll not only complain about absolutely everything, they will exaggerate the situation that they're in. And Reuters even says, Reuters was unable to determine how representative the intercepts are of the conditions in Russia's armed forces. The Ukrainian intelligence source said they illustrated the challenges facing Russian soldiers, but did not elaborate on how the recordings were selected exactly. Even Reuters, trying to present this information, these 17 phone calls, as representative of the conditions amongst Russian troops, admit further down in the article that actually there's no way to tell if this is actually representative of the conditions Russian troops face along the line of contact. It also says the SBU said in a statement it was constantly monitoring the situation in occupied parts of Ukraine, including via telephone intercepts, but it did not provide any further details. So it's constantly monitoring Russian troops all along the line of contact from June until now, September, and they have 17 phone calls. This is what they can show Reuters and say, see, look how bad things are going for Russia. And when you really think about it, what does this actually tell you? It tells you that things are probably going quite well for Russia relative to Ukraine. And you have to dig very deep to find Russian soldiers complaining about the conditions along the line of contact. When you look at the situation manifesting itself on the battlefield, you see Ukraine suffering as it throws men and machines into Russian defenses, not disarray amongst Russian forces. They are holding the line. They are defeating the Ukrainian offensive. And speaking of sending machines into the line of contact, into the defenses Russia has prepared, let's take a look at this British Challenger 2 tank that was destroyed. So we'll go to the BBC. British Challenger 2 tank hit in Ukraine, and there's a picture of it burning on fire. And the article says, a video shared on social media and analyzed by BBC Verify shows a badly damaged British-made tank. A Western defense source told the BBC that the British-made and supplied Challenger 2 tank in Ukraine was initially immobilized by a mine. That mine explosion caused a fire in the rear fuel tank, at which point the Ukrainian crew of 4 evacuated the tank to safety. The Western defense source said that while the empty tank was immobilized, it was then targeted by a Russian Lancet loitering drone, which destroyed it. It is the first verified sighting of a Challenger 2 on the front line since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. So what does that tell you? If the first verified sighting of the Challenger 2 amid the fighting is of it burning, destroyed and burning. And this is far from just a lucky shot by Russia. This is what is going to happen to absolutely every British Challenger 2 tank sent to Ukraine that attempts to approach the line of contact and engage Russian forces. They will be damaged, they will be destroyed. They may even capture some of them. There's not a lot of them. And the BBC even goes on and explains the UK announced that it would send 14 Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine back in January. At the time, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said the battle tank would help Kiev's forces push Russian troops back. And of course, that has not happened. That will not happen. The Challenger 2 tank, if that does happen, the Challenger 2 tank is not going to be part of it. Built in the late 1990s, the Challenger is more than 20 years old, but it is one of the most modern and capable tanks at Ukraine's disposal, in addition to the German-made Leopard 2 tanks, which are also burning in heaps all along the line of contact. They are intended to provide Ukraine with better protection and more accurate firepower. Ukrainian tank crews were trained on how to operate them in March. And back in January, I published this video 7 months ago. Will Western main battle tanks turn the tide in Ukraine? And I said, no, they wouldn't. And in that video, I talked about how they're going to be training them for a very short amount of time. It's nowhere near enough time for them to be effective, even just as a tank crew, let alone as a tank unit, let alone amid combined arms warfare. I talked about how the Challenger 2, the Leopard 2, and even the M1 Abrams, the US-made M1 Abrams, how none of these main battle tanks are super weapons. They are not invincible. They have seen modern combat elsewhere. They have been destroyed by especially modern Russian anti-tank weapons. I even shared this article from 2007, the Telegraph. Ministry of Defense kept failure of best tank quiet. So back in January, I talked about this old article from 2007, which said one of the British Army's Challenger 2 tanks was pierced by an Iraqi insurgent missile more than 8 months earlier than the government has previously admitted. The Ministry of Defense had claimed that an attack last month that breached the tank's armor was the first of its kind in 4 years of war in Iraq. But another Challenger 2 was pierced by a powerful rocket-propelled grenade in August last year during an attack that blew off part of a soldier's foot and injured several others. The Challenger 2 is reputed to be one of the most sophisticated tanks in the world, and those used in Iraq by British Army are built with Dorchester armor, the composition of which is a top secret. The tank is also fitted with explosive reactive armor at its front that should deflect any weapon fired at its hull. The Ministry of Defense has finally confirmed that the tank's armor was breached last August and has said that an investigation was conducted to discover why the explosive reactive armor appears to have failed. However, the department refused to comment on its findings, citing security reasons. And a lot of the myths that surround the supposed invincibility of Western main battle tanks is owed not to their actual performance on the battlefield, but carefully managed war propaganda. And this article confirms that they were covering up the failures of the Challenger 2 back in Iraq. And we don't know if the Challenger 2 tanks sent to Ukraine have this top secret armor or not. But even if it did, if the tank failed in Iraq up against poorly trained, poorly armed insurgents, how do you think it would fare against well-trained, well-equipped Russian troops? How desperate is the situation for Ukraine? I went over this article a little bit with the Duran, Alex Christoforo, and Alexander Mikuris in a recent live stream. I highly suggest people watch that. We covered a lot of ground. Alex and Alexander really broke down the fundamentals of this conflict that the Western media has been trying to ignore. And one of those fundamentals is military industrial output. So let's look at this Financial Times article. Ukraine cannot win against Russia now, but victory by 2025 is possible. Allies must ramp up weapons production to give Kiev the means to overpower Moscow once and for all. And this is by Richard Barons. He is a former general in the British Army and was previously commander of Joint Forces Command. So he's someone who you would think should know what he's talking about. But this is what he says. Ukraine's current counteroffensive will not throw Russia out. Not that anyone expected it to. Well, if you were reading the Western media before the offensive was launched, you might have thought that. Nor is it likely to cut the occupation in half before the winter, which might have been one of the more optimistic aims. Again, this was something that was assured before it was launched across the Western media among these Western analysts and journalists. It continues, it has, however, shown how the Russian army can be beaten, not in 2023, but in 2024 or 2025. Thus, the refrain among Western allies of supporting Kiev for as long as it takes. The modest progress achieved this summer shows that while overcoming a well-prepared conventional battlefield defense may be one of the hardest operations in war, it can be done. But no, it cannot be done. Because the whole point of Russia's defensive lines being layered was to allow Ukraine, if there was an assault that was sufficiently large and powerful enough, to take over one of the many lines of defenses. That's why they were built in layers. It was meant for Russian forces to fall back if necessary. So the defenses are not being overcome. They are working exactly as designed. And the fact that we're 3 full months into the offensive and Ukraine has not even made it through the first of these main defense lines, they're still stuck in the security zone, actually means they have not overcome anything. It is a catastrophic failure up until now. The article continues. It says, Ukraine has enough air defense to cover about a third of the country. Shortages of artillery ammunition were resolved only temporarily by the US providing cluster shells. Ukraine will take until mid-2024 to reconstitute a sufficiently powerful air force and is very short of the key equipment needed to clear mines. Fixing all of this will take the war into next year at the least. Well, Ukraine does not have an air force to speak of. They have a handful of warplanes that carry out a very small number of attacks with standoff weapons like the Storm Shadow cruise missile. And this is something that is not going to impact the outcome of the fighting. There is no way for Ukraine to rebuild its air force. The idea of sending F-16s to do so has already been revealed, even amongst the Western media at this point, of fantasy. It is something that would take years to do properly. If they rush it, if they send these F-16s too soon, they will end up exactly like German Leopard 2 tanks and British-made Challenger 2 tanks. They will be destroyed. This article then mentions 5 prerequisites for Ukraine to achieve victory by 2025. It says, first, Kiev must not press for substantial battlefield success before the means exist to deliver it. War is never best conducted as a close-run thing. Ukraine must be made stronger and Russia weaker, or there will be a stalemate. And what he's admitting here, this former British Army general, is that the offensive has totally failed. It is a complete failure, and for them to continue pressing on in this stage is simply going to feed what is left of Ukraine's fighting capacity into Russian defenses, where they will be destroyed. The article continues, second, relentless pressure must be maintained on the Russian occupation throughout the winter. This means sustaining the successful bite and hold operations, advancing in short bounds to reduce casualties and stay within artillery and air defense cover, within the limits of sustainable manpower and ammunition supply. Pinning Russian forces to the front will steadily erode strength, will, and reserves. If the Red Army's morale is already poor, make it poorer. Well, in reality, along the line of contact, Russia is actually making progress. When you are waging a war of attrition, you are fighting against a military with more troops, more equipment, more ammunition, and you want to get in there, bite and hold. You're just subjecting yourself to greater losses in men and materiel. So this is a fantasy, and the fact that he's calling the Russian armed forces the Red Army kind of maybe gives us some insight that this person is not really here with us in time and space. They are lost somewhere in the past. Third, Ukraine must systematically weaken Russia's military grip on its territories into 2024 and beyond. Smashing the artillery arm is important, and so too are attacks on deeper targets across occupied Ukraine. The objective is to destroy Russian military capability faster than it can be replaced, rendering it unable to withstand a stronger future Ukrainian offensive. And they're talking about, among other things, these Ukrainian drone strikes deep inside Russia. They hit airfields. They may destroy some warplanes here and there, but they are nowhere close to eliminating Russian combat power faster than Russia can replace it. Not even close. There is not even a roadmap to how Ukraine could ever reach a point where they could reduce Russian military capabilities faster than Russia's military industrial output can replace it. Then, fourth, he says, the Russian Black Sea Fleet must be neutralized as an engine for Moscow's devastating cruise missile strikes and a key constraint on the export of grain. Ukraine's own missile strikes and rapidly expanding maritime drone capability can damage Russian ships faster than they are replaced, but they aren't. They aren't now. By spring 2024, the Black Sea Fleet should be playing no major part in this war. Again, entirely delusional. It's not going to happen. The Black Sea Fleet is playing a role. It will continue to play a role. But even if Ukraine managed to sink every single ship in the Black Sea Fleet, Russia is not only using the Black Sea Fleet to launch cruise missiles. They also have an air force with a large number of warplanes doing likewise. So again, this demonstrates that this general, this former British Army general, does not even understand what is going on amid this conflict right now. And then he says, the fifth and most important aspect is to accept that this war turns on the defense industry's capacity of the West and Ukraine as the determining factor in military success. In other words, military industrial output is going to determine success. Whoever is able to produce more material, which is what I've been saying since this all began. More could be provided from stocks, but Ukraine's campaign now relies on allies ramping up their defense industries. Ammunition from newly expanded production lines will take until at least mid-2024 to arrive in quantity. This should enable a major turning point in Kiev's offensive capability. And again, no, it cannot. And no, it will not. It will not arrive by mid-2024. At the earliest, it'll arrive sometime in 2025. And even if, say, the United States is able to fully expand artillery shell production, for example, to match its target production rates, it'll only be half of what Ukraine is currently firing right now on a daily basis. And what it is firing right now on a daily basis is far less than Russia is able to fire on a daily basis. So even by 2025, or in some cases, some articles have suggested as late as 2028, they will only have half of what they need to maintain their current rate of fire, which does not even come close to matching, let alone exceeding, Russian rates of fire. So this is a very bleak assessment for Ukraine, even by this former British Army general who dwells entirely in a fantasy realm. The actual reality is even worse for Ukraine. Ukraine and their Western sponsors have absolutely no way to match or exceed Russian combat capabilities. There's a gulf between them that seems to actually be growing. And again, Alex Christoforou and Alexander Demikiouris have covered in depth recent articles across the Western media talking about, admitting that Russia not only has more equipment, but it's more modern than what the West is able to provide Ukraine. So no, Ukraine cannot win by 2025. They cannot win by any date in the foreseeable future, as long as this reality in terms of military industrial output exists. The West will indeed do everything possible to perpetuate the conflict. Of that, be certain of. Just like they did in Syria, that conflict continues to this day. This isn't going to turn the conflict in Ukraine's favor. What it's going to do is ensure the country is more thoroughly destroyed in terms of its territory, its infrastructure, its people. Everything is going to be more thoroughly destroyed as the West does everything in its power to perpetuate the conflict. So that does it for this update. I will continue keeping an eye on this conflict as it unfolds. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing to my channel. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Please check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. In the video description, I also include all of the links to everything that I referenced in the video. There are also ways in the video description below for you to help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel, so if an ad does for some reason pop up, feel free to skip it. It's not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To those who have been supporting my work, whether it's a one-time donation, month-to-month donations, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, getting the word out there, I greatly appreciate that. I could not do this work without that support, so thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.